And I said, you know, we're probably the only life in the universe. And when you go out tonight, look up at the stars and realize that we may be the only life in the universe and what responsibility we have to save it. And Patty Davis came up to me, who was Reagan's daughter. And she said, I want you to see my father. I think you're the only one on earth who can change his mind. And I said, well, I'll see him, but I don't want Ed Meese there or Jim Baker or Michael Diva. And she said, okay. So she called me 2 days later and said, we've got an hour at the end of his working day. And I said, what time is that? She said, 4 o'clock. So we had lunch in a French restaurant, and we were in this big black limo and walkie-talkie agents. We drove into the southern portico. We got out. We went into the downstairs library in which there were no books. And we waited for a while. I was a bit nervous because it was the president, and I was scared of him. And he came in all dithery, and he didn't take my hand, so I shook his hand and said, how do you do, Mr. President? And then he didn't know where to sit. And there was a table at the back of the room, a long table. I said, you sit there and I'll sit here. And Patty sat opposite us. She didn't say anything. We were there for an hour and a quarter. I had more time with him in private than any other person in his 2 consecutive terms of office, 8 years. They kept him hidden. And then he started. I said, well, you probably don't know who I am, do you? And he said, yes, you're an Australian. You read on the beach when you're a young girl and you're scared of nuclear weapons. And I said, yeah. He said, well, I too am scared of nuclear war, but our ways to prevent it differ. I believe in building more bombs. And we're off to a great start. He spent more money than all past presidents combined, mostly on the military. And then he just didn't know any data or statistics. I just finished Missile Envy and I had facts pouring out of my eyes and ears and mouth. And he'd say a few things and I would stop him and correct him. And remember when he got anxious, he'd get a red flush on his cheeks, he'd get uptight. So I'd take his hand and I'd pat it and reassure him. And as a physician, I was analysing his IQ because you have to with patients. You have to know approximately how intelligent they are to make sure they put their suppository in at 6 a.m. and they take this tablet before breakfast and one after breakfast. And I guessed his IQ was about 100. That's what I would have said. He was a nice old man. He would have been a good chicken farmer. He was good at digging post stumps in his ranch, but he was totally inappropriate as President of the United States. At one point, he reached in his pocket and he took out some notes and read to me. I took some notes. He said, people who work for the KGB are either Soviet agents, KGB or Soviet agents. And I said, that's from the Reader's Digest. It was from the John Barron article the month before. And he said, no, it's from my intelligence files. And Paddy reassured me afterwards that they were one and the same thing, that he did religiously subscribe to the Reader's Digest and he virtually had never read a book in his life. The Pentagon used to teach him about weapons by sending him cartoons of weapons. And I did meet a State Department man who was about to go to Central America and they needed briefing papers, so he wrote a briefing paper on the countries down there and he showed it to his 9-year-old son and said, what do you think of this, lad? And the son said, great, Dad. So they sent it to the White House and it was sent back. Too complex, please simplify. So I left the White House really in a state of abject terror, having seen face to face who the Commander-in-Chief was and who gets to press the button. I didn't think I had much effect on him, and however later I thought maybe I had, because he did work with Gorbachev. And if you remember, they went to Reykjavik in Iceland and spent 2 days, and 2 mere mortals almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the planet. However, Reagan was attached to his Star Wars concept. Gorbachev wouldn't accept it, and they parted. And if you remember seeing George Shultz after that momentous historical event, he was absolutely shattered. He said, we did this, and then we reached this, and incidentally, the Americans came with no facts or figures, no plans, but the Russians were very well prepared. So here's Reagan and Gorbachev downstairs. It was a tiny house. Upstairs in the bathroom, sitting on the lavatory with a board over the bath, was Richard Pearl. And Richard Pearl was doing all the numbers and trying to work up what they were going to do. And in the basement were the KGB, protecting Gorbachev, but they got a bit drunk on vodka and they tossed a lighted match into the waste paper basket and caught fire, and they nearly burnt the whole place down. I went there and I was told this by the Icelanders. So Schultz was excited. You could see his body language. We did this, and then we did this, and at the end his face just fell, and he said, but it didn't come to any conclusion. And that gave a vision of what we could do. And when people say we can't get rid of nuclear weapons, that's a ridiculous statement, because we almost did, but we missed the opportunity. And then Schultz turned into a great statesperson and worked with Shevardnadze, and they worked brilliantly together. Then was elected George I. Now, George I did work for the CIA, but in retrospect, he actually did a few good things. He unilaterally eliminated quite a lot of tactical nuclear weapons, removed them from the Korean peninsula, thank God, with what's happening now. And he said, I have to help Gorbachev because he's got a belligerent military unilateral moves, and then was elected one William Jefferson Clinton. Now, Clinton is a very intelligent man with great charisma. However, he's got no courage, and he wasn't a true leader. So what he did when he got elected was set up a nuclear posture review headed by former Senator Les Aspin. Aspin looked at the data, and he saw that as they dropped the bombs, Moscow just turned into a huge blaze of red. There are about 60 hydrogen bombs targeted on Moscow, because they have a plan in the military called SIOP, Single Integrated Operational Plan, where as the weapons were pumped out of the labs and the corporations, junior officers, never did the president oversee this planning and targeting strategy, nor the senior officers. It was junior officers. It was almost pin the tail on the donkey. We'll drop one there and we'll do. There was such a redundancy of weapons. Railway stations, railroad crossings were targeted, shoe factories, anything the enemy holds most dear, America puts at risk. And as one person said in the military, I don't care what the enemy holds most dear, if he, and it's always a he notice, values grandmothers, we target grandmothers. And I was particularly offended by that statement because I'm a grandmother. So during the Cold War, PSYOP had 2,500 targets in Russia. There are only 240 major cities in the Northern Hemisphere, okay? But since then, since the Cold War ended, they've now got 3,000 targets. China's targeted for the first time for a long time. Russia and Australia's terribly targeted because we've got 34 US military bases, including the biggest CIA base in the world that orchestrated this terrible thing in Iraq. And then Les died of a heart attack. Les said, we don't need the weapons, we're going to get rid of them. And he had a compliant man in the Kremlin called Yeltsin, who is a hardened alcoholic and really wasn't capable of doing much except he did work with the United States. Then a young man called Ashton Carter got into office. Now, this is all written in a book by Jane Nolan, which I've referenced because I always wondered what happened. And Ashton Carter was young, altruistic, and no match for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they brutalised him the way the White House has been brutalising Colin Powell. Because you see, if you've worked at Harvard and I suppose Berkeley or in the hospitals or wherever, there's always a hierarchical structure. And those on the top, usually males, are the most brutal. And they brutalise each other. And I've seen it in medicine so often. But that's what's happening in the White House. So Ashton Carter was brutalised. They said they called Ash to the carpet. And at the end of the posture review, nothing changed. The weapons were still on hair trigger alert. America's still got a policy to fight and win a nuclear war against Russia, lo and behold. And at the end, one general was heard to say, if you threaten our missiles and our early warning system, baby, that's threatening the family jewels, which I think is the most significant thing I'm going to say tonight, because the cause of this nuclear madness is the reptilian midbrain. And to compare the missiles to the male genitalia, I mean, there's some deep psychological pathology in that. And if you look at the Pentagon language, it's replete with sexual innuendos. Missile erectors, soft laydowns, deep penetration, hard lines, soft lines. We'll have a nuclear war like one big orgasmic wump. That's how they talk. In front of women on a stage, you know. They've got no shame or embarrassment. That's how it's like sports language. And I'll get into the etiology or cause of killing later that I've tried to analyse.